All right,
ready? Will you pull that door?
Yeah, thanks.
All right, guys, we're going to get started.
How to fix the future. How to fix the future.
How to fix the future. How to fix the future.
How to fix the future.
How to fix the future.
How to fix the future.
How to fix the future. How to fix the future.
How to fix the future.
How to fix the future. How to fix the future. How to fix the future. How to fix the future.
I think in order to fix the future, we can fix the future.
The question that's been posed is, how do we fix the future?
Wow. And tonight we're going to find out. Please welcome Andrew Keen. Thank you all for being here. I'm Nuala. I'm the president and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology. And the first bone to pick is, that I'm not in the book, by the way, which I'm deeply offended about.
Oh, you're kind of in it.
Because I'm fixing the future. I was busy fixing the future.
No, you organised an event, which is in it.
I did. No, I didn't know. Anyway.
Didn't you? But you were part of that.
I sure was. We'll
You're not
talk about that
allowed to talk
later.
about
It's off the record. That was Chatham House rules. You're not supposed to talk about that one. So here we
But
are.
you're still officially an organizer, no? Chair. Officially off the record, you were the chair.
I'm not in the. But anyway.
No, but you were at that event.
I'm very, very excited to have you here, and a dear friend and a colleague, and someone trying to do exactly what we're trying to do, which is think about the hard questions. And Andrew doesn't like to be called a skeptic, a techno-skeptic, but he is doing something that CDT has long done, which is zigging when others are zagging, meaning he's told us all what's wrong with it, and now that everybody's finally woken up to the fact that there are things wrong with it, he's going to tell us tonight how we're going to fix it. So where do we want to start? Tell us
Well,
how
we
you
can
got
start on the skepticism side. We just did a podcast where Brian said, "Oh, you're the internet skeptic," and I used to be called the internet curmudgeon, or the guy who was always trashing technology, which was never true. My background is as an internet entrepreneur. I'm as pro-tech, as wired, as into gadgets as anyone. What I've done, though, in 2007, I wrote a book called Cult of the Amateur, which was a very controversial book because it was the first book that really challenged the assumptions of the Web 2.0 movement. If you remember, we don't talk about Web 2.0 anymore. But back then, there was this promise that we were democratizing the internet, we were doing away with gatekeepers, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Instagram, that the professionals would be disintermediated, the people, to use kind of Marxist language, would acquire the tools of production, and the elitism and biases of traditional media would be done away with. We'd live in a better world, a world with more innovation, more opportunity, and more truth. Now, we all kind of laugh at that now, because we know where a disintermediated media has led us. We know what's happened. When you do away with curators, when you do away with notions of truth, you end up with Vladimir Putin's office full of trolls in Moscow, where he's paying people to fiddle and ruin and corrupt our democracy. So back then, I was called a skeptic and a curmudgeon because I didn't buy into it. I didn't drink, and as an entrepreneur, I'd drunk the Kool-Aid before. I'm not claiming always to be immune from the Kool-Aid. But I didn't drink the Kool-Aid of Web 2.0. So people call me a skeptic. But actually, I think, to be fair, I was a realist. I simply said, this is not working, and it won't work, and it will actually undermine our culture, undermine our democracy, and it's not for the benefit of humanity. It's actually for the benefit of a small group of very smart technologists who are the new monopolists of this age. So since Cult of the Amateur, I wrote another book called Digital Vertigo, which is my least well-known book, which for those of you who are authors, books are like children, and when the books aren't successful, you love them even more. So I actually love that book because it should have been called Cult of the Social. And in fact, in the UK, the edition was called Cult of the Social. But I basically made the argument, and this was written in 2012 when Facebook was really at its height, that the social media was actually antisocial, that social media was turning us all into narcissists. Personalization was actually resulting in more and more fragmentation of community, and we were less and less able to talk to one another. And then 2015 I wrote a book called The Internet's Not the Answer that suggested that the internet industry was resulting in more monopolies, more concentration of power, a winner-take-all economy that, again, is fine if you work for Google or Facebook or Amazon, but not really fine for the rest of us. The corrosive impact on work, on on economic equality, on innovation were bad. So having written all those, the kind of culture, I guess, well, if I'm a skeptic, now everybody's a skeptic. Now every week there's a new piece about Scott Galloway just wrote a feature piece, I think, in Esquire about breaking up the tech monopolies. Frank Furr of the New Republic, ex-editor of the New Republic, wrote a book this year about how tech was corrupting our culture. Jonathan Taplin, a very well-known West Coast friend of mine, tech entrepreneur and impresario, has written similar sorts of books. So it's all caught up to this moment where the dream, it may not be turning into a nightmare, but we're beginning to wake up from the dream. The Kool-Aid's, the effect of the Kool-Aid is wearing off, and we're beginning to understand that the century of smart machines isn't necessarily one of smart human beings. So we need to fight back. So, given that I've written 3 books exposing, in I think a realistic way, the problems with what was happening in Silicon Valley, I figured there was no point in writing a 4th book, firstly because I was already bored with the whole subject. Books always repeat. And secondly, everyone else was writing these books. So I figured, okay, well, we know the problems, the consensus kind of exists. Inequality, the threat of unemployment, the corroding of our culture, the surveillance capitalist business model of Silicon Valley. What are we going to do about it? So I spent a year on the road. I went to Estonia, Singapore, Germany. I spent a lot of time on the east and west coast of the US, India, and I wanted to find examples of things that entrepreneurs, regulators, consumers, labor activists, citizens and educators were doing to fix this stuff, because this is the central problem of our age. This isn't peripheral, this isn't marginal. Tech is the thing in itself. Every industry, from transportation to healthcare, obviously media, finance, education, every industry is being radically transformed. And the same themes that happened in media, the concentration of power, of inequality, of troubling business models, are as true of every other industry. So we've got to get this stuff right. It's not going to be done overnight. There's no app to fix the future. There are no simple solutions. The book's quite historical, looks back at the Industrial Revolution. That's the map we need to rely on, and it took generations to fix a lot of that stuff, and some of it still isn't fixed. But the digital revolution of today, I argue, and again, I'm not alone in this argument, it's as profound, as structural, as deep-rooted, as transformative as the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. Every century or two, we as human beings go through one of these great transformations, and we're going through one now.
So what struck me is the theme of what some call man versus machine, what we call here at CDT the digital self, the rights and the boundaries of the human being in a digital age, person versus company, person versus government, person versus society, and tech as an intermediator of those relationships or a disruptor of them. You talk a lot about free will, and Thomas More, and human agency. Tell us more about agency and how it's being disrupted.
Well, many of you, I'm sure you seem all, you're all tech insiders of one kind or another. You've read a lot of books about tech, and all too often in these books, the first chapter is either entitled Moore's Law or is about Moore's Law. Gordon Moore, of course, being the founder of Intel, and he came up with his law, I don't know how to pronounce it, eponymous law, which actually he never thought of as a law. Other people turned it into a law that the power of computer chips will double every 18 months. And that's the engine of the revolution. It's a scientific law, it's not a moral law. He's not saying it's good or bad, it's just a reality. And that's the thing underpinning all these dramatic changes. That's why we carry around, I don't know where what iPhone is, we carry around supercomputers in our pockets today, which 50 years ago we couldn't have fitted into this room. And why in another 30 or 40 years, God knows where they'll be, but they certainly won't be in our pockets. We'll probably be in its pocket. So I come up with an alternative to Moore's law. I call it Moore's law, but this one is premised on Thomas More, the 16th century English author of Utopia. And I go back to Utopia. The book is, as I said, it's a realist book. It's not utopian. And I don't think More himself was an utopian. And his book, Utopia, was an attempt to remind us of reality rather than of utopia. But what More, I think, argued in Utopia is that he didn't come up with Moore's law, his own Moore's law, but I developed it as an alternative to Gordon Moore's law. My Moore's law suggests that it's our responsibility as human beings to determine agency. I compare the 16th century with today. Moore's great enemy was Luther, and he was living at a time of even more dramatic transformation than today, where we had discovered, for better or worse, that we weren't the center of the universe. And we discovered the New World and all the other radically disruptive elements of the Reformation and the Renaissance. And in the midst of all this disruption, Luther came along and came up with the theory of predestination that suggested that God was so infinite that whatever we did on the earth didn't actually make any difference to whether or not we were saved. More, who was more of a traditional Catholic, was also a humanist, and he was part of a Northern European Reformation humanism, which made man the center, or made human beings the center of the world, and suggested that it's our will that determines the future. And I think Utopia was a reminder of that. That's what I argue in the book. I think today we need a similar sort of message. On the horizon today is not predestination or the New World or any of the other disruptive things about the 16th century, but it is smart machines. We've created devices, algorithms, things that replicate us in many ways, that replace us when it comes to work, that compete with us. And that's the great challenge of this century, is to figure out who we are in an age of smart machines. Now, what I do in the book is argue that there's one thing, and I quote a woman called Ada Lovelace, a 19th century English woman who invented the idea of software. Remarkable woman, a self-taught mathematician who was the daughter of Lord Byron, a romantic figure, a remarkable life. She was the business partner of Charles Babbage, who invented the analog computer. Lovelace, right from the beginning, when she thought up the notion of software, she said, look, there's one thing that human beings can do which software will never be able to do, which is have goals, which is to think for itself. Software will never have consciousness. And so my argument in the book is that software, smart machines, will never have agency, will never be able to think for itself. Now, there are some people like Bill Gates, Elon Musk, who are so pessimistic about the future that they believe this software will actually have a consciousness, think for itself, and therefore enslave us. Now, I think that at the moment it's an interesting subject, but it may be more suitable for a science fiction movie than for the world itself. Maybe in a century or two it may become reality. But for the moment, my argument is that what distinguishes us from smart machines is our agency, is our ability to think for ourselves, to be creative, to have goals. And so, in the digital 21st century, what will determine the fixing of the future is for us to display that agency, whether it's against these huge tech monopolists, whether it's against the threat of smart machines. All too often when you have these conversations, people will stick up their hand and say, well, what can we do? These forces are so huge. This technology seems so inevitable. I just did an interview for some radio show, and someone said to me, isn't all this inevitable? And I'm very, very wary of that word. I think it's a very dangerous word. Of course, it was used by historical materialists to talk about the inevitability of the revolution. And all too often, I think that word is thrown around. But there's nothing inevitable. We don't know the end of this story. There's no guarantee it's going to end well. But the end of the story will be determined by us, by our ability to manifest agency, to articulate our own collective interests. And as I say in the book, we've always had the same tools to do this: regulation, innovation, consumer power, citizenship, and education. Nothing's changed.
Okay, well, my next question, which is your 5 tools. So the singularity is not coming?
The singularity is not coming, I don't think. I think it's always too easy to exaggerate these things. I'm not really a hardcore technologist, and I certainly wouldn't be willing to have that sort of argument. I mean, someone like Kurzweil has predicted, I think it's in 2026. But I don't think it's imminent. It may come one day, but at the moment I don't think it's the issue that should be concerning us. There's a guy called Andrew Ng who teaches computer science at Stanford. He's an expert, one of the world's leading experts actually on AI, and he said worrying about computers ruling the world and having consciousness is rather like worrying about overpopulation on Mars before we even settle on it. And it's such an abstract, it's the worst case scenario, which at the moment is realistic. You know, AI is still in its infancy. It's a massively important development, I think, in the history of technology and in the history of humanity. Every company now is essentially, you know, Reid Hoffman famously said at one point, every company is a tech company. Today, I would argue, every company in and out of formal tech is an AI company, because that's the thing that's defining everything. So AI is a reality, but the idea that we're on the brink of singularity and that you could all be bots is, I think that's again a Hollywood fantasy.
So they're really issues of here and now then. What about this word addiction that's being thrown around a lot? So it's man versus machine, person versus machine. Are these social issues, and are they really addictions?
Well, I think we need to look, in the book I really try and look backwards on this stuff. We need to learn that we can learn from the past. So whether or not they're formal addictions is hard to determine. You know, is fast food an addiction? Are fizzy drinks an addiction? Is the cigarette industry an addiction? They are, in a sense. I mean, again, I'm not a medical doctor, but we can learn, certainly when it comes to the regulation of addictive things, we can learn from how other industries have dealt with it. So I have quite a large part of a chapter on the food industry and show the way in which the food industry evolved from being one where addictive products were being almost consciously produced to ones in which consumers demanded higher and higher quality products. So that now we're in an age of, you know, Whole Foods and high quality restaurants and many farmers markets. I think we have to be more demanding with our products. I think we have to be more demanding also with the way we use them. We don't necessarily have laws. We can't ban smoking, but we've done all sorts of things to make sure that people know it's dangerous. We can't ban Coca-Cola or Pepsi or McDonald's, but we are trying to put the message out that these things aren't usually very good for you, and I think we have to do the same with tech. I just saw a piece which didn't surprise me, but I think it's a story that isn't more aggressively told, that it's poor people who are addicted to technology, because it's always poor and addicted people, poor and ill-educated people who don't have parents guiding them, who aren't going to good schools, who are always most exploited by addictive products, whether it's smartphones or fast food or cigarettes. And I think we're quickly kind of going in that direction where smartphone use amongst the poorer demographic is much higher than amongst wealthy people. So it's an interesting thing. I think education is really important. I have a chapter on education. I sent my own kids to Waldorf school where screens are outlawed for young kids. I don't think that's necessarily a solution. My son didn't like it, and my daughter did. But we need to think radically different alternatives on education. The top-down industrial education system doesn't work. Clearly it needs to be reinvented. We can't put everything in the educational bucket. We can't make teachers responsible, or for that matter, parents, but they certainly have a responsibility.
So we're going to open up for some questions, but one or two more for me.
Mm.
Tell us again your 5 tools, your 5 areas for solutions.
Regulation, government. It's not always popular in the US, especially on the West Coast. I think in DC people are a little bit more sympathetic. Innovation, I think entrepreneurs are really important here. I spent some time in Germany where people are developing new business models for example, search engines. As I said, the surveillance model of Google and Facebook just doesn't work because ultimately it turns so-called consumers into the product. And most of us don't, and you know this better than I do, most of us don't want to be watched in everything we do. And that's the nature of the business model of Google or Facebook. They give their stuff out for free. Their stuff is amazing. I mean, I use Google a million times a day. I probably am addicted to it. But it's not a friendly business model to consumers, and therefore is, in the long run, I think, will fail. The best business models, whether it's the food industry or the transportation industry, which I also cite a lot in the book, reflect the interests of consumers. In the 1950s, America dominated the automotive industry. Their cars were dominant in the market. And then they lost sight of the interests of consumers. So, as Ralph Nader pointed out in his 1965 book, Unsafe at Every Speed, they started to develop cars which were essentially coffins. He woke people up, consumers woke up, and we saw the birth of both the Japanese and the German car industries. In fact, my book is a warning to Silicon Valley. It's not a critique, it's not skeptical, it's simply saying that unless you change your business model, unless you move away from this surveillance capitalism, ultimately your fate is that of Chrysler, your fate is that of GM or Ford. And the future will lie with the equivalent of Mercedes or Toyota in Germany or Japan. And I spent some time, as I said, in Germany looking at new businesses. This is a very dynamic market. I think I did spend some time in Silicon Valley, but it's all too easy to always assume that all the solutions lay there, and I think that's a mistake.
You had 2 so far. You've done regulation and innovation. Tell us the other 3.
Consumer power. I think consumers have to be much more demanding. And again, the food and the car industry is a good example of that. Education and civic engagement. The responsibility of citizens to really shape a better world, which is kind of like a meta thing. It's sort of Moore's law in itself. The thing is these 5 aren't necessarily siloed. They kind of work together. Sometimes, a good teacher is also a good citizen. I also think that, whilst we talk about regulation and innovation, I think the best kind of regulation is innovative. So I spent some time in the book talking to Margaret Vestager, the EU Commissioner of Antitrust. And I show how her antitrust initiatives are actually creating a more level playing field which benefits innovation. We're beginning to see, I think, the beginnings, the seeds of an antitrust wave, I think, in the US. I was with some people this afternoon who spoke about a fundamental shift in the atmosphere in DC, in the fact that you've got Ted Cruz and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders all talking the same kind of language about antitrust. Means that America seems to be catching up in some ways to Europe. But it's always important to remember that regulation is not against, or the best kind of regulation benefits innovators rather than the other way around. And I think the problem, perhaps, with the Silicon Valley model is it hasn't been regulated enough. But again, as always in these early times with great transformations, that's usually the case.
Any other examples of anywhere we're getting it right, or anywhere in the world people are getting it right?
Absolutely. I spent some time in Estonia, very small country on the edge of Europe, in the northeastern tip, on one of the old part of the Soviet Union, now an independent state. I think Estonia is interesting in the sense that it's small, it's a very, very highly educated population, very high incidence of connectivity, lots of entrepreneurs. They're doing some really interesting experiments with a new kind of social contract on data when it comes to the relationship between citizen and government. which was required to be transformative. It's the opposite of the Chinese model, which is a kind of reinvention of Orwell's 1984 in a digital context. And of course, it's a very direct response to what's happening over the border in Russia. So I think that Estonia is a model that's extremely interesting. I also have a chapter on Singapore. I'm slightly more ambivalent on Singapore. They have a Smart Nation initiative. You know, Singapore is controversial in the sense it's obviously not a democracy in the American or the Western European sense, but they're doing some stuff right. The two countries, as I suggested, that are doing everything wrong are China, although the Chinese economy is remarkable. The Chinese model of collecting everyone's data and then determining their benefits through their political correctness is really a kind of Orwell 2.0. And the Russian model of hiring buildings full of trolls and then paying them to undermine our democracy is also a model. You know, I know you're particularly interested in privacy. I'm more ambivalent on privacy having written the book. I used to be a kind of privacy ultra and always assumed that we could turn the clock back to the 19th century and protect people's privacy in the face of these new technologies. I'm less convinced of that now because I just think it's so hard to do. With smart cars, with smart homes, with smart cities, with smart bodies, it's going to be harder and harder to protect our privacy in that absolute sense that we were able to do through the legislation of people like Brandeis and Warren in the late 19th, early 20th century. So what we need are new arrangements, new kind of architectures of transparency, maybe using interesting new technologies like blockchain. But we need to fundamentally rethink privacy. We can't just fall back into the past.
Questions? Yeah.
Yeah, hey Andrew, Steve Del Bianco. A dozen years ago, it was a presentation you gave on Cult of the Amateur. You had me at hello. Ranting
I had you what?
Had me at hello. It was an excellent talk. You've heard that expression.
Yeah.
So,
did I have you at hello today?
Apparently not.
I've heard this hello all year long, so it's just an echo more than an original thought. But I remember what you said about Wikipedia as the paradigm of Web 2.0 that was destroying the ability to curate and edit and just have amateurs out there putting up facts. So I took that home.
Yeah.
I got some Encyclopedia Britannica CD-ROMs and tried to force my kids to use Encyclopedia Britannica. I got to tell you, that was a losing battle because within a few months and I found myself turning to Wikipedia first. Yeah. And it was fine unless it's a controversial subject. Yeah. So I just want to ask, of the things that you thought the Cult of the Amateur would destroy, are there some bright spots in there, like for instance Wikipedia, that have actually proved to be an amateur-driven improvement over the old model?
That's a really good question. You know, I'm ambivalent on Wikipedia. It's certainly an amazing product. I mean, I remember when it came out, everyone thought, that's insane. And then we began, it was like when Airbnb came out. Oh, we're just going to rent our house in your home. Sure, oh yeah, that's going to work well. Right, and of course, it's become a multi-billion-dollar company. The same with Wikipedia, this idea that people would work together for free to build information was just absurd, and yet it's happened. And there is a lot of value when you do a Google search, and this may reflect badly actually on Google, Wikipedia always seems to come up first. The problem though with Wikipedia is that it reflects all the worst aspects of Web 2.0 in the sense that it's supposed to be democratic, but when you look at the numbers, it's a tiny group of people dominating the editing that tend to be male, that tend to be very aggressive, and tend to have very specific interests and ideologies themselves, which they claim is universal. But when you look at Wikipedia, I mean, I haven't looked that carefully recently, but you know, the entry on some of the, the entry on Mark Zuckerberg will be 10 or 100 times longer than the entry on Marie Curie or Henry VIII. So it certainly reflects the interests of its editors. The other two problems with Wikipedia is it's entirely anonymous. You have no idea who is behaving. So for all we know, Putin is paying, and I'm sure this is the case, he's paying trolls to fill Wikipedia either with lies or with biases that benefit his own interests. And thirdly, and this is my biggest problem with Wikipedia, it doesn't pay its contributors. I think one of the most corrosive elements of Web 2.0 was this idea of there was some nobility in free information. The idea that, well, you shouldn't charge for your information, that was bad. You shouldn't charge for your labor. What that did was decimate the newspaper industry. It meant that a whole generation of people weren't willing to pay for their news, so they rely on Facebook, which is all biased, and which is an echo chamber culture. And most troubling of all, how are you supposed to earn a living as an information professional? As someone who writes for encyclopedias. I really blame Jimmy Wales for this. I think Jimmy Wales is a realist, he's a business guy as opposed to an idealist. But he was for, the tail wagged the dog of Wikipedia, and he was forced to comply with these absurd ideas. And ultimately, the only way, you ask me what am I encouraged with? It's not so much the democratization of media, it's the fact that people are coming around to realizing that the only way to build a viable, reliable media is by paying for your content. So I'm encouraged by the fact that people are once again paying. The paywalls now are back in vogue. I remember in 2007 saying, newspapers should charge for their content. And the only person who agreed with me was Rupert Murdoch, which obviously didn't make him or I very popular. But now everybody is charging for their content, from the Wall Street Journal to the Financial Times, even Wired, which was the ultimate vehicle of this nonsense, last week or last month came out, kind of almost apologetically said, look, to run a proper business, we have to charge for our content. So I think we're just coming, again, it comes down not so much skepticism, but realism. There's only two ways you can run a media business. Either you charge for your content, or you build a business around advertising. There's nothing wrong with building a business around advertising, but because of the dominance of these, Google and Facebook, which I think now sell 75% of all the advertising online, because of the commodification of advertising through this winner-take-all economy, it's impossible to build a viable business around advertising online. The only way you can build a reliable information business is either by charging for your products, a formal paywall, or through subscription. So the other positive thing in the book is the subscription model. The Spotifys, the Hulus, the people who are saying, okay, for $20 or $30 a month, you can have all the music in the world. It's the greatest deal imaginable. Some people don't like it. But what's really encouraging, I think, is young people are coming around to it. The final chapter of my book is dedicated to young, the book is dedicated to young people, and the concluding chapter, the conclusion, focuses on that. And it's young people who are driving this. They are the ones realizing that it's worth paying for good information. It's worth paying for Spotify. Now we need to make sure that Spotify actually distributes its revenue in a fair way for artists. So the movement is positive, but I think the Wikipedia model just doesn't work. You've got to pay your contributors, and you need a media, any company, but particularly a media company, has to be transparent. You need to know who wrote the thing, and Wikipedia is unable to do that. And there's nothing noble about free content. Ultimately, free content exploits everyone. The only communities, the only companies that benefited from free content was Google. Because every time that free content was distributed, they made money through advertising. It's not surprising that they were financing many of these groups that fetishize free content.
Andrew and Bob West, one of the things that you're mentioning in your book is education, and that's one of the things that I have a strong concern about in the United States. There's a large percentage of people that don't see value in public education, for example, and the extreme opinion would be that the university education is either not a good value or a waste of time. And I look at this in terms of being a systemic issue in the long term, because we're not on par in the United States with other countries in terms of their level of education, or the importance of education, right? So my question is, do you have an opinion on that, or do you have a suggestion in terms of how you solve that problem?
Well, it's a big question. As a joke I always have in the book, which isn't so funny, is, you know, we have these big discussions and at the end we say, oh, well, it's schools can fix this, universities can fix it, which is another way of saying we have no idea of how to fix it. So we're going to dump everything onto teachers, and they have enough problems in the first place.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think when it comes to America, I mean, there are other issues in America, and again, this is not a book on it either, it's certainly not a book on America, and it's not a book on education. Education is just one chapter. What I would say is that some of the interesting education experiments are taking place overseas. On the university level, I had, in my chapter on Singapore, I spent some time at an MIT sort of conglomerate university in Singapore, where humanities are being actively integrated into engineering education. I think the reality is, and again, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's true, and I'm quoting someone in the book, the Swiss guy who actually orchestrated the referendum in Switzerland on the guaranteed minimum income. You know, most of us, we're a relatively similar generation, most of us here, at least my generation, you know, we did, or my parents' generation did one job in their lives. My generation maybe do 5 or 6 jobs. Our kids are doing 6 jobs simultaneously. So education needs to teach us to be flexible, to develop the muscle, and I quote this in the book, the muscle of agency. Learning to be a lawyer, learning to be a doctor, learning to be an engineer, certainly learning to be a computer programmer, is not that useful, I think. So, and the sort of the temporal element of education, learning, being educated between the age of 5 and 22 or 24 probably doesn't work anymore. So we need profound structural changes, which again, it's kind of beyond the book. This is a book about broad issues, and there's just one chapter on education. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think it would be wrong to fall back on the humanities. Oh, well, all you need to do is read Plato and Machiavelli and Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and we'll be fine. I think that's in itself almost reactionary. We need a combination of the humanities and engineering. I certainly think that one of the reasons why Silicon Valley has been such a disappointment from the ethical, moral point of view is because these engineers, the Zuckerbergs of the world, haven't had that kind of ethical, moral, or historical education. But at the same time, I think the traditional humanities people need an engineering education. And again, it comes back to the machine. What can't machines do? Machines can learn to program. Machines can learn engineering and law and medicine. What machines can't do in terms of this goal or agency, machines can't learn empathy. Machines can't do this. Machines can't create intimacy. Machines can't be creative in the way humans are. So we need to reinvent our education system to focus on the very things that machines can't do. Now, that doesn't mean we need to train all our kids to become masseurs. We don't want to create a kind of low-income version of computers. But we do need to focus on the very things. And so when people say, oh, well, everyone needs to become a coder, we need to focus on STEM, I think that itself is also short-sighted, because most of the STEM subjects are actually most vulnerable to smart machines. So again, my book is a conversation opener. You know more about, as an education professional, you know more about this than me. But it does make education one of the central tenets of this conversation.
One more question over there.
Andrew, great book. I read it, ironically enough, on a flight to and from San Francisco.
Why ironic?
Well, just because it seems to be the belly of the beast out there.
Did they check? Did they take the book away when you?
They burned it.
But two questions among many that kind of occur to me. One, you do spend a fair amount of time both on Singapore and on Estonia, and it doesn't give privacy short shrift, but there is sort of an ambivalence there about privacy.
Yeah.
And the Estonia solution seems to be trust-based. Basically, there's disclosure anytime a government authority accesses your data, and so that knowledge is supposed to be reassuring because do you have faith in the government?
But it's enshrined in law. I mean, it's not just, oh, well, we'll trust you, so we'll let you do anything you like.
So my first cluster of questions has to do with the classical, the right to be let alone idea of Brandeis and how you kind of attack that. The second question has to do with the surveillance data. The other thing that occurred to me reading the book was my kids, I mean, this is an informal survey, but my kids seem to be far more comfortable with the idea that their data, that their information is out there and is being used and accessible. They regard it as a convenience in a lot of ways, whereas I think certainly, maybe our generation is more.
Well, what data in particular? What would you?
Well, the question is, do you buy that premise that the generation coming up is more comfortable with the idea of being surveilled?
Yeah.
And how do you?
I would push back on that aggressively. I would say, I think we've completely misunderstood this generation.
I totally agree.
I think we're kind of, if you want to historicize it, we're in the 50s now. And there was all this sort of abundance, but the 60s hasn't happened yet. There's this assumption, particularly of kind of tech utopians, that digital natives get it and older people don't. But I suggest in the book that it's actually younger people who are driving the kind of analog rebellion. It's young people who've embraced vinyl records and are paying again for their music, paying on Spotify, paying for vinyl. It's young people who've embraced the idea of handwriting. They're the ones buying all these diaries that are now so much in vogue. It's young people who are paying again for their news. And I actually think there's going to be a dramatic shift in views on privacy. So I think if they haven't already woken up, I mean, it's young people who are reacting against Facebook. Or, it's our generation that's still on Facebook. We're the schmucks. The kids get it. I remember I was looking at I'm not really into fashion, as you can tell, but my son is, and I was looking at some website he was telling me about, and they had a cashmere hoodie. And I said to my son, who's very much into fashion, he's actually studying it, he fancies himself as a bit of a fashionista. I said, what do you think of me buying a cashmere hoodie? And he emailed me or texted me back saying, that's the worst idea since Facebook. So the kids get it. I mean, Facebook is really the ultimate in uncoolness for kids. So I don't know about your kids, and we always have these. The problem with these conversations is that they always degenerate into the anecdotal. So our kids think this, so all kids must think it. But I am actually, and that's maybe it's an appropriate end to this conversation, I'm actually extremely hopeful about the future. But because the digital natives get it, because they're human beings too, they've grown up taking all this stuff for granted, and they're the ones who are going to react. They're the ones who are going to calibrate. They're the ones who are going to demand real reform. So I think, when it comes to privacy and trust, the real scarcity, digital theorists always write about this abundancy of the new age, abundancy of information, abundancy of data, abundancy of this and that. Peter Diamandis, I think he's the founder of Singularity University, even wrote a book called Abundance. But the really interesting thing in our new age is scarcity. That's where the value are, that's where the economic and the entrepreneurial opportunities are. And trust is one, attention is another, and privacy in another. And I think that's where the businesses of, if you like, the post-Web 2.0 world, the post-Web 2.0 economy are going to come from. So your kids need to get off Facebook.
One last one.
And there's a lady at the back. Very quick.
Well, I don't know if this is quick, but I'm
It's gotta be
interested.
quick.
What are your ideas on the future of work? If you're not.
Wait, well, that's an easy one. None of it's going to work. Well, it's kind of connected. I think we need to be very adaptable. It needs to be. The one thing on work, which I think, I've already talked about education and the need to be adaptable and invent and reinvent oneself. I think when it comes back to regulation, which is one of your issues here, and I spent some time in the book on this, we need to make sure that what I call the precariat, which is the 21st century version of the proletariat, the precarious workers, the people who are driving Uber cars in the morning and renting their homes out or their spare room out on Airbnb in the afternoon and putting together somebody else's IKEA furniture on TaskRabbit in the evening, that they have the same legal protection as workers in the more traditional economy. Because more and more, not only will we be doing 6 jobs simultaneously, but we might be doing 6 jobs or 6 different things in the same day. So I think the future of work requires the same kind of protection. I spent some time with a Boston lawyer who is pioneering the pushback against the sharing economy and making sure that these companies conform to the law. So I think we need the same kind of legal protection. I think, again, I'm not a complete pessimist when it comes to the future of work, but I do believe economists who say that many of the traditional jobs of the industrial age are going to be undermined. 47%, according to a very oft-cited white paper by a couple of Oxford economists. Now, why they come up with 47 rather than 48 or 46, who knows? But certainly many of our jobs, just think of driving. I mean, I think it's something like 25% of men in the industrial economy in the US drive for a living. Well, in 20 years, none of them are going to have jobs because lorries and cars and cabs are all going to be self-driving. So we're going to have to figure out other stuff to do. One more question for that, yeah?
As the millennial in the room, not representing everyone, but...
Am I fair on your generation?
And no. And I'm also a surveillance lawyer, but I'll be the first person in line to say chip me, because I don't want to carry all of my things anymore. And
what does that mean, chip me?
Just put a chip in me that will have all of my credit cards and my passport information and my social security number.
You mean in your hand? Or?
Yes,
Yeah,
actually,
Russia already has a proposal on this.
Which isn't unrealistic, by the way. This is the future. This is the real future. But anyway, go on.
But my point is, the other reason, it's not just the convenience, it's the fact that all of my data is out there anyway, and it will probably take us an expert 30 minutes to get all of the sensitive information.
All your data, you mean when your pictures when you're half undressed? I mean, what does that mean, all your data?
My social security number, my passport, I don't have those pictures, but, maybe some embarrassing texts, all of that can be accessed and hacked, and so basically my question would be, the fact that all of our data, I guess everyone's in this room at some point shared it, it's already out there, so trying to regulate and trying to go back and roll back would be very hard, so I was wondering, what would be a way for us to do it or to protect us better?
Well, as I said, I started off as a sort of privacy fundamentalist, believing that, we can go back to the 19th century, as Peter said, the 19th century version where, Brandeis and Warren protected us. I'm not sure I'd go as far as you, but I certainly think it's harder and harder to protect the privacy of our data. So I think we need to look to these new arrangements. I think the Estonian model is actually an interesting one, where there is transparency but accountability as well. And the most important thing, and as the former president of Estonia reminded me, is data accuracy, making sure that people aren't fiddling with the data. They're next to the Russians, and that's what the Russians specialize in, fiddling with the data or fiddling with other people's data. So what we need to do is make sure that that half-naked photo actually is you and not your neighbor or somebody else, or those compromising photos or compromising emails are yours and not somebody else's. So I think that's as much an issue. But I'm interested in, you've been very generous in letting me come here. What's your position on this? Your center. Can we go back to the 19th century?
No, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, and you have asked the right question, and I think you've posited almost the right framework, which is some level of legislative overarching structure, which is why CDT has always promoted the idea of an omnibus federal privacy statute in the United States to put us on par with the nations, many of whom in the world that already have that structure. So there is the accountability and transparency and oversight for corporate and government use of data. But I was going to ask you,
in the book I do talk about the general data protection, GDPR, general data protection law, which now the Americans are talking about copying, which is a European initiative which came out this year. It's not perfect. No one's claiming it's perfect, but it's a beginning. We've got to go in that direction. Sorry.
No, it's about use as well as collection, but I would still say, be careful what you put out there. What's your last piece of parting advice or wisdom for this crowd before we join Andrew for a drink and get our books autographed?
Buy the book and read it.